Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Northern Virginia. Joining us, as always, is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, this week in Hong Kong. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So this week we are continuing our mini-series on heterodox economists. We've been focusing on these economists this month of July. It's been 2 weeks now, tracing back to Galbraith and Torsten Veblen in the past 2 weeks. You can look those up if you missed them. This week, we will be talking about the Austro-Hungarian economist Karl Polanyi. Just as a reminder for folks who haven't listened to these before, the idea here is to look at economists from the past whose ideas don't generally inform our policy debates as they happen in national capitals, but could usefully inform our more general economic debates. And so Polanyi is best known for his book, The Great Transformation, which questions the concept of self-regulating markets. He's evoked from my own observation in the last 15 years or so, increasingly. So yeah, we thought we'd take a closer look. And this particular idea was suggested by Michael in Montreal. So thanks to him for, nudging us towards talking about Polanyi. Adam, as always with these heterodox economists, I like to start off by asking about his biography. And yeah, how might Polanyi's biography have shaped his ideas? You know, more generally, who was he? What shaped his worldview?
Yeah, so the Polanyi we're talking about is Karl Polanyi. I say that because there's two famous Polanyis who are brothers, Karl Polanyi and Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi, some people may have come across. He's a philosopher, a kind of liberal epistemological critic, somebody who hung out with people like Karl Popper. So that's that wing of the kind of Habsburg 20th century, a late Habsburg 20th century. The Polanyi brothers were born to a prosperous Jewish entrepreneurial family in Vienna in the 1880s. So they're of that vintage and more like Keynes than, Joan Robinson or Kalecki. Karl was born in 1886. And that means that his youth, right, his through his middle age really was shaped by the experience of the pre-war 19th century, early 20th century Gilded Age world, which, of course, in the case of the Habsburg Empire, had a specific nostalgia because this was an empire that enabled a polyglot, multinational, Central European universe to exist, which exploded after World War I and then was cut by the Iron Curtain after 1945. But Polanyi has a similar timeline to Keynes. Unlike Keynes, however, Polanyi is not a master thinker of his epoch in his own lifetime. I mean, he has a modest academic career, but only really acquired huge significance at a much later stage. And I would agree with you, in the last 20 years or so, he's become one of the really most widely cited thinkers. In this sense, his career is more like a Hyman Minsky, for instance, that we profiled earlier in this series, the American economist, also from an emigre background, than a Joan Robinson or a Kalecki, let alone a Keynes, who were all very significant economic thinker figures in their own lifetimes. Polanyi had influence, but it was strictly within an academic realm. Before World War I, he studied in Budapest, typical kind of move in this time within the Habsburg Empire from Vienna to Budapest. He mixed in Budapest with the real luminaries of the age. Georgi Lukács, the Hegelian Marxist, comes to mind. Karl Mannheim, the sociologist of knowledge. He was never, as far as I know, a paid-up Marxist. His wife was, which would later mark their lives together. He served in World War I as a cavalry officer, and then in a fairly typical move of the kind of Habsburg bourgeoisie, associated himself in the final stages of the war with the short-lived liberal republic in Hungary, the Karoli Republic, which was then overthrown by the Bela Kun left-wing revolution, Bolshevik-inspired revolution, then succeeded, of course, by Horthy's authoritarianism, which caused Polanyi to move back to Vienna. And between 24 and 33, he worked in Vienna as a correspondent for Austria's Economist magazine, literally the Der Volkswirt. And this was the period where he really began to cross swords with the right wing of Austrian thinking. As Quinn Slobodin, for instance, has shown very powerfully in his book Globalists, one of the origins of modern neoliberalism lies in a you could say, nostalgic or sort of future-orientated nostalgia of conservative economists in Vienna in the 1920s who were trying to think of ways of reconfiguring the world so as to restore the economic functions of empire, which had been destroyed by the war. Polanyi goes the other way and says, right, if we have to take national democracy as the main line of future development, what are the crises this will cause and what might be possible solutions? His life, to answer your question finally, is profoundly shaped by the subsequent crises. So in 1933, as the Depression hits Austria and politics radicalizes, he goes into exile in London. From 1933 until 1940, he's very closely associated with the British left. He teaches for the Workers' Educational Association. And this accounts in part for, if you've actually tried to read The Great Transformation from cover to cover, you'll realize that Polanyi goes down the rabbit hole of British social political history of the 18th and 19th century. And this is in part because the book derives from the influences he sucked up amongst British leftists, British Marxists, the sort of people who will become the Christopher Hills, the Eric Hobsbawms, the E.P. Thompsons, the Marxist historiography of Britain, or the Fabians, who are kind of mainline statist socialism. He's never able to make an academic career in Britain. The British university system is relatively closed to emigres like himself. And so in 1940, he takes advantage of a Rockefeller grant to take up a position at Bennington College in Vermont, where he writes The Great Transformation from lecture notes. It is very well received as a book. It earns him the possibility of a move to Columbia in 1947. Unfortunately, however, his wife can't get essentially a visa to live in the United States because of her communist background. She settles in Canada. And so Polanyi begins what sounds like, a very modern long-distance relationship, commuting back and forth from Toronto. He persists in doing this in part because in 1950 he receives an absolutely massive Ford Foundation grant to work on classical antiquity and economic anthropology. So in all of these ways, it feels like a very kind of modern, academic, dispersed biography. It's the first one of our group that has really felt like this, I think. This gives rise to his later work on economic anthropology. He retires in the 50s, in 1953, and then lives out his days as an advocate of kind of détente in the Cold War in Toronto. And it's really in his belatedly after his death, that his thought has acquired truly massive significance. We'll come on to that later in our chat.
So one of the ways that Polanyi challenges economic orthodoxy is that he challenges the inherited idea that, markets are natural. This is an idea that traces back to classical economists like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Why exactly does Polanyi disagree with that assessment of markets being natural?
So the crucial thing is, this is where we have to kind of get into anthropologist mode. Like, what do we mean by natural? Like, what do we mean by things which aren't natural? What's culture? What's politics? What's the social? What's economic? These are the sorts of questions that make Polanyi interesting, because he doesn't start from the premise that we know. And I mean, you might say that, people have to eat. Sure, we choose to wear clothes. We need shelter. These things you might reasonably say are natural. But how we meet those needs, how we understand them, that's something else. So all societies have structures for material reproduction, but they also have belief systems that organize how they think about that process of material production, how we go about deciding what to eat, when we eat, how we eat, what tastes good, what doesn't, what clothes are appropriate, what shelter, and so on and so forth, and how we organize the distribution and provision of those things. None of that is given in any sense. And Polanyi's kind of great move, his great conceit, you might also say, which I find a helpful way of reading him, especially in light of his later work, is to imagine him sort of parachuting in as a historical anthropologist of modern European society and going, well, the thing you need to understand about modernity as represented by Britain is that they're a weird tribe. They're this weird tribe that from the 18th century onwards began to convince themselves that this thing they called the economy, which in other societies is simply the way in which you provide food and shelter and organize who gets what. This thing they called the economy has its own laws. So they made a kind of fetish out of it. They made a system with independent rules out of it, in the same way as peoples in Polynesia or Africa or deepest, darkest Latin America in the minds of Western anthropological imagination. We approach them and say, well, how do you organize this? Well, he took 18th century and 19th century Britain as his object and say the really weird thing about them is they have gods, speakers that are things like money, and then they have priests which interpret that, people like David Ricardo and Malthus, who explain to them how this system works, and they're convinced that this system is independent, and then they call that independence of human society natural. And that's what's going on in 18th and 19th century Britain. I mean, we shouldn't simplify too much, because when we say natural, it's also important to realize that what natural means to a Malthus or a Ricardo is not necessarily the same as what it means to us. So notably for a Malthus, who's a deeply devout Anglican, it's really a theodicy problem, right? Malthus's problem is obviously God made nature. And because God made nature, the theodicy question is, can God have meant for us to be poor and miserable? And so Malthus has to come up with an elaborate construction of why it is God constructed a world that made some people poor and miserable and, inflicted premature death on them. And that's part of his demographic regulation model, because people are sinful and will have too much sex and procreate too much. And so you need a stabilizing force. That's what nature means for Malthus. For Ricardo, it's a little bit more kind of, low temperature. It's an obsession above all with issues which have to go back to physiocracy. It's issues of productivity and how land is productive and how labor is productive. And so how rents and prices adjust to the natural physiognomy of the productive apparatus. But in any case, from a Polanyian view, these are two priests of the weird late 18th, early 19th century belief system that says the economy is separate and natural, and it therefore follows laws that you must not violate for fear of terrible things happening. And those laws are, in Malthus's case, directly theological, and in Ricardo's sense, more coolly equilibrium-orientated kind of visions. And that's what Polanyi, I think, is describing. And he makes this, specifically in terms of an interpretation of the poor law, which was 18th and 19th centuries Britain's kind of basic social safety net system, we would say now. And on the other hand, a system like the gold standard, which was the way in which, from the 19th century onwards, with increasing clarity and self-consciousness, a British-dominated economy organized the functioning of money. And will become an object of anthropological critique also by Keynes, who explicitly evokes late 19th century anthropology, even more explicitly than Polanyi, in fact, to critique the gold standard as a fetish-like object.
Yeah, one of the ways I think this is useful is that the terms of this debate are hardly even sensible in our day-to-day economic discourse now. This reflecting on the justification for the economy is not something that typically anyone is doing in this sort of extra economic sense.
You sure? I'm not sure I agree. I think we're kind of, certainly New York.
I just mean it's taken for granted. It's like whether it's natural or not seems to me it's like rarely ever.
Because it clearly isn't, right? I mean, whereas to the 1990s people, it's the economy's stupid. I mean, that's a powerful naturalization.
Yeah, precisely. But it's also hegemonic and therefore not
was hegemonic. Yeah, surely was. I mean, was and is now quite profoundly fragmented.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about Karl Polanyi. To move on to, I guess, another aspect of Polanyi's project, as I mentioned, he advances an argument that totalizing markets, that increase their reach, at some point become self-undermining. And I'm curious, how to unpack that argument. And why does he believe that totalizing markets are ultimately, self-undermining?
So the crude version of this, which is easily assimilated by conventional political science, sociology, and has in fact been assimilated by quite a lot of surprisingly mainstream economic historians, is a kind of social mechanics. If market mechanisms operate too effectively, too violently, they inflict too much rapid distributional change, they produce a backlash. And Polanyi's writing in the 30s and 40s, so it's easy to understand what he's referring to here. The more people move around the world economy from the late 19th century onwards, as mass transit, on steamships becomes more and more affordable, the more you get backlash, nativist reaction. The more commodities are traded globally, the more you get protectionist backlash. The more free capital moves around the world, the more you get literally first-generation populist uprisings against the gold standard. And all of these movements of incipient social unrest in the late 19th century, you could just call them socialism or something, but socialism is too small scale a phenomenon. For Polanyi, it's basically just societal resistance to the unfettered logic of this weird beast which 19th century bourgeois ideology created, which was the disembedded economy. So that's one side of this. And, it's familiar from readings of populism that we see with regard to Brexit or Trump. Too much globalization breeds its own gravedigger is part of the argument. But I think for Polanyi, there's also a kind of metaphysical level, which is that social mechanics, that distributional struggle, is one element. The other is a metaphysical unease, right? Fundamentally, the totalizing market turns things which aren't commodities into commodities. And that's a fiction that can work very productively. It generates huge efficiencies. It oils and greases the movement of the world economy. But at some level, it also breaks apart because land is what we stand on and what grows our means of survival. It literally is a human independent existence of awesome potential, beauty, but also risk. Labor is literally our lives. Money is not a fetish, it's a legal convention. And there's only so long that you can maintain these highly productive fictions. There's only so long that the kind of religious mojo of liberalism can really sustain itself before it begins to fray and disintegrate and collapse under the weight of its own. It's asking us to suspend disbelief. It's asking us to treat our lives as something that can be just straightforwardly commodified. And it won't work forever. And that, I think, is the sort of grounding metaphysical critique that underpins the more conventional sociological, social mechanics of Polanyism. And the two can go together, right? One way of mobilizing a social grassroots movement is to say something like, property isn't for speculating with, it's for living in, right? That's Xi Jinping's famous line about, Chinese property. But you could see the same thing being acted out in conversations about groceries in New York. Food is what people need. It's a basic right. It shouldn't just be driven by market economics. It certainly shouldn't be, under the veil of market economics, be handed over to self-interest, monopolistic interest groups, which are going to gouge people and create food deserts. People need to eat. Let's talk about how we organize how food is provisioned. So all of these are Polanyian moves because they couple together the power of a kind of, shall we say, a naturalistic, almost natural rights discourse. This is what people need, with a sociological discourse that says, and here are the disgruntled people who can be mobilized around these kind of themes.
It's interesting because it wasn't just, it seems to me, a kind of normative claim that Polanyi was making about these limits, but an empirical claim about the kind of natural limits to the expansion of markets. And I suppose the question that raises for me is, markets have clearly expanded significantly in a global sense since Polanyi's day. And so should we, conclude that, history has proved Polanyi's theory wrong to some extent? I mean, he the title of his book that I mentioned, The Great Transformation, he was sort of predicting a transformation that would occur when those limits are reached. And so it doesn't seem like that has come to pass, or am I misreading what he was referring to?
Well, I think here we have to read Polanyi, as a historian would, rather than an anthropologist, and say, well, what is the horizon of expectation against which he writes? Book comes out in 1944, and you would say that the 25 years afterwards, massively confirmed Polanyi's basic intuition, right? That what was needed after the fiasco of the disembedded 19th century economic model in the interwar period in the 20s and 30s was a re-embedding. And that's precisely that was the common sense of the 40s, 50s and 60s, right? This is what Bretton Woods was about. Okay, capital movement, but not purely speculative movement. Okay, commodified labor, but trade unions bargaining. Okay, commercial property development, but also public housing, right? All of these are moves which are squarely within the Polanyian vision, and they're kind of consensual, right? This is the norm. We were speaking in a previous episode about development. This is what development meant in the 50s and 60s, was various types of public-private, hybrid mixed economy model. One of the things that Polanyi was involved in after his retirement from Columbia was establishing a journal called Coexistence, which was a classic peaceful coexistence, Cold War era social science undertaking, which was about demonstrating that really market economies and socialist economies were kind of converging in the way in which they provided for their society's advanced collective human needs. And as we, of course, all know, that consensus broke down in the 70s, gave rise to a series of reactions which, on the one hand, led to the collapse of the communist system, a new era of crisis, and to neoliberalism, as you were saying, Cam, in the West, and ultimately a kind of move back towards an autonomization of the economy. It's the economy stupid, the idea that you can't buck the laws of the market, that whole 90s, 2000s discourse. And at that point, you could have said, well, Polanyi's like well and truly dead now. He belongs to those who do not understand the broader development of history, but who would want to maintain that position in the light of the last 20 years, 15 years, right? What we're living through is a kind of new Polanyian epoch in which, in dimension after dimension, there is in fact a concerted effort to insist that the 90s, 2000s idea of a disembedded, self-governing, self-stabilizing, history-dominating, history-bestriding world economy was another kind of fiction, another weird anthropological preoccupation of the Davos tribe. I mean, to put it really crudely, right? That's the standard, indeed, journalistic line at this point, was that we live beyond this. So rather than thinking of Polanyi as a sort of anthropological thinker or a kind of one-shot deliverer of truth, I think at this stage we have to think in terms of a kind of Polanyian phases, a kind of cyclical view. I mean, he spoke about a double movement, which was the making of market, autonomized, disembedded economies, and then the backlash against that. We could then talk about a third movement. It's beginning to sound more like movement in the musical sense at this point. You know, the third movement is one of re-disembedding. That's the story of the 70s and 80s. And people like Thatcher and the Polanyi's antagonists in Austrian economics thought of it that way, like this was a half-century long struggle over the lessons of the early 20th century that were finally now being decided in their favor. And you'd have to say at the beginning, at least in this, from the second decade of the 21st century onwards, we're dealing with a fourth movement, which is a re-embedding. We're doing it all over again. We're inventing a Marxism for the 21st century. We're reinventing social democracy and calling it the DSA. That's what the current moment would be. And that's what gives Polanyi his incredible relevance. Not that he was right for all time in 44, but that the toolkit he offers for understanding the late 19th century and early 20th century crisis seems remarkably prescient for understanding the crisis of the late 20th, early 21st century.
Yeah, it does strike me that Polanyi is maybe the ultimate kind of theorist of this embeddedness concept, which one does hear sort of evoked in economic discourse today. But Polanyi really seems to examine that concept in all its facets. And that's also the case in terms of his later anthropological work that you have mentioned, which sometimes seems to me not evoked when Polanyi is discussed. It seems like the Great Transformation, that work gets spotlight, but that later work is sometimes neglected. And I'm curious, in that work, what are the various ways that Polanyi discusses that markets can be embedded in communal social life.
Yeah, I really think the later anthropological work is very helpful as a way to properly understand what he's trying to do in the 44 book. And if you read, say, Keynes compared to Polanyi, the difference is that Keynes is like a Martin Luther or a Calvin of liberalism. He's saying, look, folks, all great old ideas we need to improve and reform. Whereas Polanyi really is the anthropologist of religion who comes along and looks at this system and says, wow, you've got some weird ideas for organizing the way in which you ensure material reproduction. And he's different from a Marxist, right, who would say you're tempted to think of this as religion, but actually this is the effect of a complex ideological system. So he's a sort of, if you triangulate him with Marx and Keynes, he emerges as this interesting separate figure, and it's precisely the anthropological side which I think makes him more accessible. And above all, it was a historical anthropology. It was an anthropology also continuously engaged with standard economics. And the standard economic argument is to say, when you teach basic economics, microeconomics, you postulate Robinson Crusoe scenarios, sort of imaginary tribal encounters in which people have to invent money to trade, this kind of thing, right? And then you postulate they're philosophical anthropologies, you would call them. In other words, made up stories about how people actually are to bootstrap various types of social scientific theory. And one of the key logics here is that economists will say, for as long as we have sophisticated societies, we find that they have markets. Look, go back in antiquity, you'll see they had markets. And so therefore, if they had markets, well, then markets must perform then the role that markets perform in the later 20th century when there's markets for everything, as you were saying. So then that would imply that we live in a timeless continuum in which markets are really the way in which economics is organized. And the work that the Ford Foundation grant enabled the Polanyi and people to do in the 50s and 60s was to basically outflank this and to say, well, yes, sure, actually, it's undeniably true that for long distance trade between states, for various types of very specialized use, there were markets, even in deepest antiquity. Yes, there were markets. But if you look at how the vast majority of socioeconomic production was organized, it wasn't organized around the market. It was organized around three different types of model. One is reciprocity, in which you have various types of gift giving closely tied to notions of status and social bond, in which you express something from one person to the other by the transfer of a good. Another was redistribution, in that most sophisticated societies since the Neolithic, when we began to settle down, realized that having people dying on the street from hunger was not good for social organisms. So you needed a redistributive mechanism, not a market mechanism, a kind of basic needs orientated general organization. The high status end of that was reciprocity. The lower status of that was redistribution. And then thirdly and finally, societies from the Neolithic onwards were organized crucially, and huge elements of economic and social activity were taking place within the oikos, within the household, within the, however you defined it, domestic sphere. Now, obviously, you can end up in all sorts of really problematic anachronisms projecting back our notion of the domestic to the past when there wasn't a public in the sense we understand it, but something organized around the core of family, of reproduction within that unit. So you have three logics: a kind of quasi-political economy, which is the reciprocity economy, a basic needs economy, which is the redistribution economy, and an intimate sphere, household reproductive system, which is the oikos. And those, through most of time in most human societies, are actually where all the real action's at. There are markets, undeniably, fairs, places where people interact, but they're a tiny bit. And that's the way in which the Polanyi team concretely tried to elaborate notions of embeddedness in general. And rather than projecting our notions of disembeddedness back onto the past, what they would challenge us to do is to say, right, well, how do you do the work of reciprocity, of redistribution, and of householding?
Yeah, I guess given all this, it's not a surprise that Polanyi has been as popular as he has been in the last couple of decades. Hopefully this piques some further interest for those who haven't yet engaged with him. This will mark the end of our mini-series on Heterodox Economists, but it's a recurring mini-series, so it won't be the last time we talk about heterodox figures in economics. We are open to suggestions, so do let us know if you have any ideas. But in the meantime, thanks to Michael again from Montreal. And thanks for listening. We'll be back, as always, next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.